And welcome to this video. It's going to go through Act 1 of Inspector Calls by J.B. Priestley. As you're watching along with the video, you can copy down the annotations that we've got here. There are quite a few. I'm going to go through them quite quickly. You can make notes on the characters, and obviously we're going to look at 3 parts of these. We're going to break it down into Act 1, Act 2 and Act 3 as the play follows. Your copy might be slightly different, which is absolutely fine. You just have to look at the page references there. But if you're using this copy, first of all, you've got quite a lot of strong introductory information about Priestley's life, about why he wrote, about kind of who he was as a person and what influenced the writing of Inspector Calls and his other texts as well. Theatrical context, so you've got kind of how the play was performed, why it was performed, where it was performed, and you've got a few other bits and notes about performance as well. So there's quite a lot of good background information here you might want to go through and highlight later on. We're going to start there by looking at Act 1, and before we do, we're going to look at the list of characters. One of the good things about Inspector Calls is that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters on stage. Edna, the maid, some students like to write about Edna. It's a great forgotten character there as well, but really, it's the 6 characters here who are most important. Arthur Burling, it's Mr. Burling, Sybil Burling, his wife, Mrs. Burling, Sheila Burling, Arthur Burling's daughter, Eric Burling, his son, you've got Gerald Croft, and you've got Inspector Gould. And obviously, it's an evening in spring 1912, so this is set before World War I and World War II have happened. But it's written in 1945, so it's kind of first performed in 1946. So it's written after World War I and World War II have happened, so with all the benefit of knowledge of what's happened there. But it's set before both world wars, and obviously at a time when the world was very different. The first thing to say with Inspector Calls is the stage directions. So those of you who do drama will know about this. The stage directions are absolutely enormous here, much bigger than any other text. And that's quite an interesting point. There's obviously clearly a lot that Priestley wants to do with these stage directions. Some of the things we see, students talk about the idea that the lighting is pink and intimate. Pink suggesting something that's warmth, it's friendly, it's calm, it's cozy. There's also a seedy and more sexual side to that pink and intimate lighting, which obviously is mentioned particularly with reference to the behaviour of Gerald and Eric and their involvement in the plot. Is this foreshadowing of that through the lighting? And then obviously the inspector arrives and the lighting becomes brighter and harder, almost that glare of lighting reflecting the harshness and severity of the inspector's interrogation of the Burling family. They're a wealthy family. They've got dessert plates, champagne glasses, decanters of port, cigar boxes and cigarettes. So they've clearly got all the trappings of a wealthy family, or a family who are giving the impression of being an upper class family. You've got a description of the characters, and there's a lot of key information here. You've got Burling as a heavy-looking, rather portentous man in his middle 50s, with fairly easy manners but rather provincial in his speech. So he speaks with an accent, he speaks differently to the other character. He doesn't speak in the same way that Mrs. Burling and Gerald would speak to each other. He is a man, if you like, who has done well in life and in society, but isn't actually part of the upper class society that his wife and Gerald certainly represents. His wife is about 50, a rather cold woman, a perfect description of her. She's such a linear character. She doesn't change from beginning to end. And her husband's social superior. She is of a higher status than her husband in this society. Sheila's a pretty girl, looking through this theme of women, particularly Eva Smith, Daisy Renton, and Sheila, as being described as pretty in the play. The amount of times pretty is used. Beauty and looks have status in the society of 1912's Britain. This idea, if you're good looking, it doesn't matter what you are as a person, if you're a good looking girl, you'll get on in society. Sheila is very pleased with life and rather excited. Her immaturity, she's described as a silly child. Gerald Croft is an attractive chap about 30, rather too manly to be a dandy, but very much the easy, well-bred young man about town. Again, foreshadowing Gerald's behaviour. Easy, well-bred. So well-bred, he's from a good family, but he's got easy manners. He'll get on with prince or pauper, and he's a young man about town. Everyone knows who he is, and of course this affords him certain advantages when it gets to his involvement with Daisy Renton. Eric in his early 20s, not quite at ease, half shy, half assertive. I think this quotation here sums up Eric's character superbly. He's half shy, half assertive. He's at that stage of a lot of people in their early 20s where they think they know everything there is to know about the world. And of course, they're very much wrong. And we see Eric drinking quite a lot here. And this idea that he's half shy because he's got all these ideas. He's got all these the things that he wants to do in the world. He wants to be an adult and live like an adult. But he's in his 20s and he lives at home with his father. He's essentially, his father kind of keeps him, if you like, and he can't cut those apron strings that keep him at home there, if you like. And he's half assertive, and we see this later on. He does try and assert himself, but he's often just quashed by his father. And half shy, half assertive, these are all great quotations. Just because they're in the stage directions, please feel free to use them and explore them. They are as much part of the play as the words here. And they're all pleased with themselves as well. So the play opens with the Burling family drinking port. Port is obviously an upper class drink. It becomes a status symbol there. If you can afford to drink port, they're not drinking pints of Stella. They're not drinking Lambrini. They're drinking port. It's a symbol of upper class. And then obviously when the inspector comes in later on, they try and offer him port as well as a means of kind of, if you like, not bribing him as such, but trying to get him on side. So port is this drink that is used there. It has credibility in this society. And they all drink this like one of these purple-faced old men here. And there's all this kind of playful banter between the family, between Burling and Sheila. Sheila refers to her parents as mummy there as well. Arthur thanks the cook in front of Gerald for making a really nice dinner, and Mrs. Burling reproachfully telling him off. You're not supposed to say such thing. You're not supposed to praise the working class publicly, particularly in front of the son of Lord and Lady Croft, a member of the aristocracy. That's just her job to cook a good meal. She's supposed to do that. And then Sheila here on page 3 of this version, except for all last summer when you never came near, half serious, half playful. Again, we've seen this, the younger characters, half shy, half assertive, now half serious, half playful. Sheila's like, yeah, you're one of the family, apart from that summer where you never came near me, ha 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 ha. But this idea, is that foreshadowing what's to come, this sense of dramatic irony? We know, the moment someone mentions this has become something that happens in society now. We know if someone mentions they're busy at work. Sometimes they are busy at work, don't get me wrong, but does this foreshadow Gerald's affair with Daisy Renton? And is it a sense of dramatic irony? Because we as the audience, hold on a minute, why is she mentioning that he never came near her? There's something more to that, isn't there? And this becomes apparent as we go on, and we know this is why it's dramatic irony. We as the audience know this. We're like, uh-oh, something's going to happen to you later on. But Gerald doesn't come to realise this, and Sheila kind of, again, half serious, half playful. Oh, you didn't come near me, sure, come on. But actually, she's half serious with this as well. She's actually angry with Gerald. And Mrs. Burling leaps to the defence of Sheila. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. She excuses Gerald's behaviour, but also this idea that she's a bit naive there, or maybe not naive. You realise that men with important work to do sometimes have to spend nearly all their time and energy on their business. So has Mr. Burling done the same to Mrs. Burling? I was busy at work. You'll have to get used to that, just as I had. And Mrs. Burling, if you read Inspector Calls properly, you should have no sympathy for Mrs. Burling as a character. She deserves everything that she gets. But she is very much a product of her society. She would have been born very much before the women's rights movements that we've looked at in schemes of work in Year 8. When we look at the women's suffrage movement, she would have been a product of the patriarchy of the time. She would have been treated in such a way that actually, first of all, she can't break through and fight for women's rights for her daughter. She doesn't understand her daughter because her daughter's very much a different woman to her. Time has moved on from the late, from the 1880s, 1890s, when Mrs. Burling would have been Sheila's age, to 1910. And Sheila's, in a position of greater privilege there as well. So Mrs. Burling is a product of her upbringing. And yes, we don't feel empathy for her because of the way she behaves, but also there is this idea that she is a victim of this society as much as others as well, because she can't change her ways, and she excuses Gerald's behaviour because it's obviously happened to her as well. Eric is squiffy, he's drunk there as well, and they're having their little toast as well. It's a pity Sir George and Lady Croft can't be with us, but they're abroad and so it can't be helped. Are they actually abroad? Are they on the Titanic? A bit of conspiracy theory there. Or have they made excuses and they genuinely don't approve of the relationship because their son is marrying into a lower class? And then Burling with his speech here as well. Your father and I have been friendly rivals in business for some time, although clearly Crofts is the better business because it's run by Lord and Lady Croft. And they're both older and bigger than Burling and Company. Is this as much a part of Mr. Burling's fabrication as well? He thinks they're rivals, but they're really, really not. And perhaps we may look forward to the time when Crofts and Burlings are no longer competing, but are working together for lower costs and higher prices. This is the capitalist dream. He wants them to work together for lower costs and higher prices. They charge the customers more, but it costs them less to produce whatever it is they produce. He's talking about this at his daughter's engagement party as well. That's really important. It's a time where everyone's supposed to be happy and celebratory, and yet he's using this as an opportunity to deliver this great capitalist speech as well. Mrs. Burling reproaches him again. I don't think he ought to talk business, and he kind of realises this. And then there's this moment here where Gerald produces the ring, and Sheila excitedly says, "You've got it. Is it the one you wanted me to have?" "Yes, the very one." "Oh, it's wonderful. Look, Mummy, isn't it a beauty? Oh, darling." Sheila is immature and materialistic here. She's just concerned by, it's the ring. Is it the one you wanted me to have? So she hasn't even chosen her own engagement ring. It's the one that Gerald wanted her to have. This idea that Gerald can buy her, he's bought his way into the family through the sheer experience and wealth of his father's company. And now it's this idea that he's going to buy the daughter as well with the ring that you wanted me to have. She has no say even in the choice of her own ring. And she behaves in an immature and materialistic way. "Oh, it's wonderful. Look, Mummy, isn't it a beauty?" You can almost see, mine's quite a plain band here, this idea of kind of flaunting it, the hand going in a certain way. And obviously the great big diamond on there as well that she's kind of flaunting there as well. It's a lovely ring as well. So no one's talking about the relationship here. We're talking about the ring and this idea that this ring, and Mummy, oh Mummy, it's beautiful, Mummy, isn't it? She's so immature at this stage and so preoccupied with material wealth. Look at me, I've got the ring and I am the fiance of, Gerald Croft, son of Lord and Lady Croft. And then the women go off, very much a gender role. They leave you men to their talk. And Burling gives a great big speech before they go. And he talks about some contemporary things. Now remember, it's written in 1945, set in 1912. In that interim period between when the play is set, you've had World War I and World War II, and you're starting to have to move away from a conservative government to a Labour government, and it's the Labour government that brings about social reform that's happened in World War II. In World War II you've had a situation where society's fabric has been destroyed. Class has been destroyed because millions and millions of people have died in war, and obviously it's had to be destroyed because you can't go on. Women's role in society has changed because millions of men have died in war. So the Labour government has had to change this. They introduced social reform. They introduced things like the National Health Service in the aftermath of the 1940s, in the aftermath of World War II. And obviously the Conservative government is very much one that at this time reflects the ideals and the desires of Mr. Burling and the capitalist Burlings. Last month, just because this speech, all these speeches are examples of dramatic irony, it's the capitalist belief that Mr. Burling has that is burst by the arrival of the inspector in the middle of his speeches here. And we're in for a time of steadily increasing prosperity, and of course nothing he says in these speeches come true. Last month, just because the miners came out on strike, there's a lot of wild talk about possible labour trouble, so strikes, and the strikes continue. The Germans don't want war. Nobody wants war except some half-civilised folks in the Balkans. And why? There's too much at stake these days. Everything to lose and nothing to gain by war. And again, dramatic irony. We see his foolishness, his foolish belief in what he's saying. He thinks he knows everything. He's so arrogant, he's so full of his own sense of hubris that actually he doesn't realise that people do want war and that war in itself is business. People make money on the back of war. And I'm talking as a hard-headed, practical man of business. This idea, he's hard-headed, he doesn't think, he's practical, he's just focused on himself and his own sense of gain. And I say there isn't a chance of war. He's blissfully naive. What would he possibly know about this as well? He's arrogant. He's so full of himself and his own sense of hubris, his own self-arrogance, that he can't see society. We're talking about the Titanic that's unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. And of course, the Titanic does sink. The Titanic becomes a metaphor for Burling and for capitalism in itself here, or what Priestley is trying to say about capitalism, in that if you carry on with this foolish belief in capitalism, you will be like the Titanic. You will sink. The Titanic sank. Your capitalist beliefs will sink because they will be forced to sink by something else, by the inspector who arrives later on. There'll be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere, except of course in Russia, which will always be behindhand. And this idea, we hard-headed practical businessmen, he repeats it again, we ignore all these cranks, these Bernard Shaws, these H.G. Welleses. We know what we're talking about here. We're men of the world. We're practical. We're businessmen, and we know everything. We're hard-headed. We've had to experience all these things. And of course, it's being hard-headed can be a positive thing. You're not weak, but it can also be a massive weakness, and it can be something that's exploited. And of course then, on page 8, he talks about this knighthood and this idea of the joke between Burling and Gerald. So long as we behave ourselves, don't let the police court or start a scandal, hey? Ha 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 ha. His complacent laughter. The stage directions are much worth quoting here. He's complacent. He thinks he's not going to get caught. There's a sense of dramatic irony because he does get caught. And we know clearly that something's going to happen to him. The knighthood. I wonder about the knighthood. I wonder if it's real or not. How could he possibly know? The honours list is published. I might find my way into the next honours list. Well, yeah, I might find my way into the next honours list. Is this just part of his arrogance? He's trying to say, look, your mother and father probably object to me because I'm a working class man done good and gone into the middle class. And actually, is he going to get a knighthood? Is this all nonsense, or is it just something he's saying to Gerald? You seem to be a nice, well-behaved family. This idea of the public and the private, you seem to be, because in public, that's how you present yourself, but in private, as we find out, you're anything but. So then have a little talk about this idea. He's giving his speech. A man has to make his own way, has to look after himself. This idea of the capitalist view, you look after yourself. But it's interesting, there's a pause, and his family too, of course. His own family to Burling are an afterthought, because obviously looking after Gerald, who goes out and gets drunk all the time and doesn't really do a decent job, and Sheila, who spends the money on dresses that look ridiculous on her, his family cost him money. His family are actually against this view of capitalism and wealth that he's trying to create. And it's interesting that he does see them as an afterthought, and they particularly become an inconvenience for him later on when the inspector has challenged the family. As if we're all mixed together like bees in a hive, community and all that nonsense. I mean, this idea we are, whether you like it or not, all our lives intertwined. And Burling talks a lot. He physically hogs the speech and the dialogue here between the characters, but it's all nonsense. It's all things that gets destroyed by the inspector. All our lives are interrelated. If I want, if I go and buy something for a shop, for instance, I need the person behind the shop to serve me. And if they refuse to serve me, whether I like it or not, I can't get the goods there. My life then is dependent on, or something I want in my life is dependent on the person who works in that shop. Teachers and students, we're all our lives, whether we like it or not, the person I'm driving to work behind or in front of, we're all mixed together, whether we like it or not. And while he's giving this speech about a man has to look after his own, and we're not mixed together like bees in a hive, that's what Burling's trying to say. The inspector cuts him short. The sharp ring of the doorbell, and the inspector arrives. And the inspector's described his own impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. So he gives this sense of being a dominating character. And this idea that he's actually an incredibly powerful presence on the stage too. And he does that through just the sheer impression. Burling starts by trying to give him a glass of port, trying to corrupt him straight away, because of course if the inspector's drunk, then any testimony he gives, he's trying to impress him, first of all, with the port, and we've got some port here, but any testimony he gives then would be tarnished by the fact that he's taken it when he's drunk. And the inspector is different to who Burling's used to dealing with. No, thank you, I'm on duty. short, declarative, matter-of-fact sentences in response that Priestley uses here. And then Burling tries to flex here. He tries to use his status. I was an alderman, I was Lord Mayor's, and I'm still on the bench, I'm still a magistrate, so I know the police officer Brumley, and I thought I'd never seen you before. He's trying to intimidate the inspector, and the inspector's not rising. But he is quite dramatic here. She'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant, burns her inside out, of course. Yes, she was in great agony. He adds a lot of detail to this here. He is very dramatic there. And then he goes on to describe her name as Eva Smith. Eva Smith, this idea, we'll talk about this later on when we decide whether she's a real Eva Smith or whether it's more than one Eva Smith, which the family themselves do there. But she does have the name of an every woman. You know, Smith is the most common surname in Britain, and Eva obviously is the kind of a standard name, so it could be that she is one Eva Smith, it could be that she's an every woman representing the entire working class, which is a trope often used in theatre. Once the inspector starts asking his questions and doing a little digging, though, he starts to get the port away from Eric, because Eric drinks too much and Burling's trying to cover it up and he doesn't want that to come out in public. Burling responds by saying, you know, it was 2 years ago and I've got nothing to do with the fact that she's committed suicide. And maybe not criminally, but this idea of the chain of events that the inspector tries to start, you know, and Burling says, there's something in what you say, but I can't accept responsibility. If we're all responsible for everything that happened to everybody had anything to do with it, it'd be very awkward, wouldn't it? And I suppose it's partly because the capitalist view of responsibility is money. You know, we live in a litigation culture. If you do something wrong and you say sorry, you can be sued for that, and that will cost him money. So saying, look, she's committed suicide and I sacked her 2 years ago for asking for some more money, but it's not my fault that she died. And of course, it isn't his fault that she committed suicide, but it starts that chain of events. It's not his fault, but he has some responsibility, and he refuses to accept that responsibility. And basically they ask for more money. She refuses. She refuses because it have added 12% to our labour costs. He, as a businessman, could have soaked up the extra wage. You know, he could have announced less profit. He could have taken home less money for himself. He could have been less greedy and given her the pay rise. And if she didn't like him, it's a free country. And it's interesting, Eric, even early on, it isn't if you can't go and work something else. In a capitalist-controlled labour market, as of 1912 Britain, jobs are hard to keep. And if you've got, you know, if she's been sacked from Mr. Burling, and Mr. Burling does have a reputation in society, so that's going to follow her around. And if she's got no reference to Mr. Burling, she hasn't got a job to go to. And she'd been punished for speaking, which is her right. You know, it's their right to ask for things. And the inspector picks this up. It's better to ask for the earth than to take it. A critique of capitalism. You know, it's perfectly fine to ask for a pay rise. Your boss can say no. That's fine, but you shouldn't be sacked for asking. You know, that's kind of, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. All she's doing is asking the question there. But to sack her for that, to take the earth, to take more money, to take, you know, the 12% that it adds to our labour costs that reduces profit margin, it's a critique by Priestley of capitalism. Whatever you think, whatever I think, Priestley he uses the inspector as his voice to critique capitalism, say, stop being so greedy, there's enough money to go around. And Eric starts to pick up on this socialist belief. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? Why shouldn't they ask for more money in a kind of a capitalist market? We try and get the highest possible prices. And why should she be sacked because she had a bit more spirit than the others? And Burling hasn't got a response for that. He just responds with anger and aggression. And it's interesting, this half shy, half assertive nature that we've seen with Eric. Is this because essentially he is bullied by his father? And that comes across later as we go. And then the inspector kind of finished. Sheila comes wandering in. Burling tries to protect her. Nothing to do with you, Sheila. Run along. A very patronising view of women, even his own daughter, who we've already seen he tries to, you know, effectively sell to Gerald Croft. And the inspector gets involved. And Burling, with more anger, this is uncalled for and officious. I've half a mind to report you for speaking to Sheila. And Sheila gets involved, and then she hears from this. The inspector still goes, quite shockingly, she wasn't pretty when I saw her, but she had been pretty, very pretty. And again, he kind of subverts this idea of being pretty. Sheila, the question she asks is pretty. We've seen pretty about 5 times already. In a looks-based, superficial society of 1912 Britain. You know, now you could argue 2023 Britain. You know, people are judged on the way they look. And the inspector flips to know she wasn't pretty when I saw her, but she had been pretty, very pretty. This idea, it didn't matter how pretty she is because she's dead now. She can't use that as a commodity when she's dead. And then Burling starts to realise that actually he's not the only one, and he starts trying to cover up his family, or is it just himself that he's trying to cover up here? He even says sorry. I put the only apology here, that's not quite right. Gerald does apologise, but it's one thing to say sorry, it's another thing to mean it, as I'm sure many of you will know if you've ever had an argument with somebody. It's how you act as a result of that. Burling tries to get involved and to cover this up here, and then the inspector fills in the gaps in what's happened. And there's a critique here, again, a further critique of capitalism by the inspector. There are a lot of young women living that sort of existence in every city and big town in the country, Miss Burling. So she's living in poverty, in lodgings with no relatives. She was feeling desperate. If there weren't, the factories and the warehouses wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. So Priestley, through the inspector, critiques this idea that capitalists like Mr. Burling and his company, and Gerald and Croft's company, they exploit the poor for work. Because if you're poor and you're desperate, you'll take any money you can get to work here as well. And the inspector is challenging this here as well. And Sheila says, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. Because she is part of the younger generation, like Eric, and who she understands that socialist mindset. They're people, you should treat them like people. And this idea that Sheila and the inspector start from early on in the play to have the same mindset. So Eva Smith gets her job at Millward's, and it's interesting here, she got the job at Millward's and she's sacked, and we know she's sacked. And Burling, she got herself into trouble there, I suppose, not doing her work properly. There must have been something wrong. Bear in mind that Eva Smith didn't actually do anything wrong apart from ask for some more money. She was doing her job to a high standard. Burling sacked her because she had the audacity to ask for some more money. And he assumes then that she's done something wrong at Millward's, which of course she hasn't. There's this criticality of her. It's a sense of class prejudice. Because she's the lower class, there must be something inherently wrong with her that means she gets sacked. And Priestley's challenging through that. And Burling is a very linear character. He takes no responsibility for what he's done at all. Sheila sees the picture. She gets upset. And then Burling, this idea of the nasty mess of the celebration you've made and the nasty mess of Eva Smith's life. The inspector stands up to Burling. He's got more authority than a police officer might have there as well, who's got to follow a kind of process. And Gerald's put in his place here too, as we're getting towards the end of Act 1. Eric, who's had a little bit of alcohol, I've had a few drinks, including rather a lot of champagne, and asked to turn in. And then they're kind of starting to challenge the inspector, Gerald, Mr. Burling, and Eric. After all, we're respectable citizens and not criminals. And the sense of irony here, I mean, technically is right. They commit moral crimes in the play, apart from Eric, who steals money. But this idea that moral crimes can have implications as bad as legal crimes, you need to police yourself. And also, this idea of the public and private. Yes, you present yourself as Gerald Croft, the well-bred man about town. But in private, we know what happens to you in Act 2. Mr. Burling presents himself as this great public figure, but in private he shouts at his family. He sacks somebody for just asking for some more money. And often if it were left to me, I wouldn't know where to draw the line. And this idea, there's a real power play here. This is why it's such a good moment of drama, the one lines between the characters where they're trying to establish dominance over each other. So, the inspector interrogates Sheila, and basically Sheila gets Eva Smith sacked for the way she looks. She's trying on a dress. Sheila looks ridiculous in the dress, and because of her own inability to take responsibility of her actions, she gets Eva Smith sacked. It was her own fault. At least I'm trying to tell the truth. I expect you've done things you're ashamed of too. Well, I never said I hadn't. And this idea, and the inspector cuts in, you can sort that out between yourself afterwards. I want to know what's happened here. If she'd been some miserable plain little creature, I don't suppose I'd have done it, but she was very pretty and looked as if she could take care of herself. I couldn't be sorry for her. Sheila's class prejudice. She realises that she's wrong. She has a capitalist lack of empathy at the start, which Priestley's trying to explore. I couldn't be sorry for her because she looked pretty, and because she looks pretty, that means she can find herself a rich husband to look after her in this society here. And that's what Priestley is challenging. And Sheila tries to, make herself feel better. If I could help her now, I would. Yeah, but you can't. It's too late. She's dead. And it sounds like the inspector's being quite harsh with Sheila, because he is. Because actually what people are doing when they say that, they're self-pitying. If I could help her now, I would. Well, would you really? you can't help her, so help the next Eva Smith instead of just sitting around wallowing in your own self-pity. And he still continues on here as well. And then she changed her name to Daisy Renton, and this is where Gerald is startled. What? You know, he's seen a couple of pages earlier, he feels like he's above the law, he's starting to challenge the inspector, and now he is challenged too. And he's startled here, and he gets himself a drink. He's giving himself away that he clearly knows Daisy Renton. And then the inspector goes out of the room, and Priestley does this deliberately here to allow Gerald and Sheila. All right, Sheila, have you learnt your lesson? Interrogate your own fiancé here. Well, what, Sheila? Trying to smile. They examine themselves. And he's trying to be elusive. Why should I have known her? He's being caught here, and he's lying about the affair with Daisy Renton. We clearly know what's happened. To be elusive to his own wife, you know, the woman he's supposed to love and marry, he's lying to publicly here, even though he's clearly being caught out and he's given himself away. And rather just hold his hands up and admit to it, he doesn't. He carries on. He does not reply. Is this silence or shock, or doesn't want to incriminate himself? You know, people, when they're arrested, they might say no comment, because they don't want to give themselves up. I'm sorry, Sheila, but it was all over and done with last summer. He's trying to justify the affair that he's had. I'm sorry, Sheila. Oh, that makes it all right, does it? But it was over and done with last summer. So for God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector. He's still refusing to take responsibility. What about the inspector? You've said to the woman who's going to be your wife that you've had an affair. How can that relationship continue? And he wants to keep it private because it's his private life. He wants to avoid the public scandal, the damage the reputation would do in 1912 Britain. But Sheila, laughing hysterically, you fool, he knows. Of course he knows, and I hate to think how much he knows that we don't know yet. You'll see. And at that moment, she looks at him in triumph. He looks crushed, and the inspector appears with his well. And Act 1 ends with a sense of dramatic tension. And, you know, in 1945, you'd had the curtain down here, a short break with the inspector there, and this idea, you know, you've tried to challenge me earlier on, Gerald Croft. You've tried to act elusive. You've tried to, you know, you've not told the woman that you're supposed to love about this affair, and now you're going to be forced to confess there. So that's Act 1. You've got the establishment of the characters, all characters, and we start to see the interrogation of Mr. Burling and his lack of change as a character, and we start to see the interrogation of Sheila and her starting to change and accept socialism rather than being a capitalist at the start. And it ends with Gerald being interrogated by his fiancée and trying to cover up what he's done, and the inspector appears, almost the cavalry there for Sheila at the end, and the curtain goes, and we'll look at Act 2 in more detail next time.